burned to the ground. That was Colonel Vance's price for widows who refused, and 9 days into Sabine's countdown, a wounded stranger asked for nothing but shelter, one night in her barn, no name given, blood soaking through the shirt he held pressed flat against his side. She almost turned him away at the door. Every homestead, still standing on the Powder River Flat that October, had learned hard and recent exactly what happened to a family that took in a stranger. Colonel Rourke Vance's riders hadn't cleared first, and a woman alone, with 9 days left on a burning deadline, did not have room to spare for anyone else's trouble. Least of all, a man who wouldn't say where he'd come from, or who had put a bullet through him. But the lantern caught his face full on for one long moment before he swayed on his feet, and something in the steadiness under all that gray pallor stopped her hand on the latch, and she thought unbidden of her husband's voice the night before he died, telling her that a house built only for the safe and the certain wasn't much of a house at all. She let him in. Nobody on that flat watching Colonel Vance ride his fence lines with the easy authority of a man who had never once heard the word no and meant to keep it that way, could have guessed that the stranger bleeding into clean straw in a widow's barn that night had a reputation, or that men who ran outfits exactly like the Circle V had learned the hard way to go pale at the mention of him. Nobody could have guessed that before Vance's self-appointed 9 days ran out. The quiet man in the hay would stand up in front of the whole flat and finish something that had started for him a long time before he ever set foot on Sabine's land. If stories about the ones who ask for nothing and give back everything are the kind that keep you up past your own bedtime, stay with this one clear through to the end. Because what happens in Sabine's barn on the 9th night is not where this story stops. Let's go back 3 weeks to the morning the first notice went up, nailed to a fence post, before anybody on that flat knew how short the countdown was going to get. Her name was Sabine Marrow. She was 26 years old, and it was the first week of October in the fall of 1887. On the Powder River Flat in Wyoming Territory. Sitting square in the middle of a range boss's ledger as the last piece he needed to close out the whole basin. This is the story of the widow who wouldn't sign, and the wounded man who walked into her barn one night with nothing but a bullet wound and a reason of his own to hate everything Colonel Rourke Vance stood for. Sabine had come to that flat 8 years before as a bride, riding in beside a quiet, careful man named Josiah Marrow, who had staked 160 acres along the good bend of the creek and spent every season since proving up on it with a patience that folks in town used to tease him about, who read almanacs by lamplight and rotated his hay ground like it was a puzzle he intended to solve properly instead of quickly. They had built the place, slow and honest, a soddy first and then real lumber hauled up from the railhead 2 summers running, a barn raised in a single long Saturday, with half the flat's families pitching in the way neighbors still did back then before the burning started. Josiah had died 18 months earlier in a grass fire that swept the north section during a dry September, caught trying to drive their cattle clear of it, and the county coroner had ruled it an act of God and closed the book on it in a single afternoon. That the fire had started in 3 separate places along her fence line on a still, windless evening, which was not, in her long experience of prairie fires, how God generally started them. Colonel Rourke Vance had arrived on the flat 4 years before Josiah's death, buying out a modest spread at the basin's western edge with money nobody in 3 counties could quite trace the source of, and had spent every season since turning that modest spread into the Circle V. an operation that now ran cattle across better than 40,000 acres of leased and owned and simply occupied range, water rights secured, section by section, the way a careful man secures a winning hand, a little pressure here, a generous buyout there. A fire that always seemed to start on a windless night and always seemed to leave the range boss's own grass untouched. He wore the title colonel out of a militia commission nobody had ever confirmed existed, wore a gray coat too fine for range work, and carried himself with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice because he had a segundo named Coy Latham who raised it plenty for him, and a sheriff in town, Ogilvy Trask, who had learned early and thoroughly which side of the Circle V's ledger kept his own badge pinned to his vest. The list of what Vance had already taken from that flat ran longer than anyone liked, reciting in one sitting. The Delaney family, 5 of them, had lost their barn and half their stock to a fire the same September Josiah died, and had pulled up stakes for Nebraska within the month, rather than wait for whatever came next. Old man Emmett Fenwick, who'd homesteaded the Flats' eastern rise since before the war, had gone half-blind trying to beat back flames from his own hay barn 2 winters back and now lived above the mercantile in town. On Charity he was too proud to call by that name, his acres absorbed quietly into Circle V range. The Marrow family, 4 generations deep on land, they'd worked since before the territory was a territory at all, had simply vanished from the flat one spring, their cabin standing empty and stripped within a week, and nobody in town would say plainly what had made them go. Only that Coy Latham had been seen riding out toward their place 3 separate nights the week before they left. 6 homesteads remained standing on the Powder River flat by that October, and 5 of the 6 had already signed quiet title deeds selling out to the Circle V at prices that insulted the years of work sunk into the ground, and had done the arithmetic Vance wanted them to do. Sabine was the last holdout on the Good Creek bend, and everyone on the flat, herself included, understood exactly why Vance wanted her acreage worse than any of the others. Her 160 sat squarely across the only reliable year-round water between the Circle V's home range and the free grass to the north. And a man who controlled that water controlled every acre for 6 miles in either direction without needing to own a single blade of grass past his own fence. Vance had come to her himself twice in the 18 months since Josiah's death, sitting his gray gelding at her gate with his hat tipped politely and his voice pitched low and reasonable, explaining that a widow alone couldn't be expected to hold proved-up ground against a hard winter, offering a figure that would have covered her debts and bought her a comfortable room in town and nothing more. And both times Sabine had made plain that Josiah's land wasn't for sale, and both times Vance had ridden away with the same unhurried courtesy. The third visit, 2 weeks before that October morning, hadn't come from Vance himself. Coy Latham had ridden up alone, dismounted without waiting to be invited, and nailed a single sheet of paper to Sabine's own gatepost, while she stood on her porch watching him do it, a notice written in Vance's careful hand offering her 9 days. 9 precisely, a number Latham lingered over twice as though savoring it, to reconsider the colonel's generous offer before the Circle V, in his words, stopped asking politely about water rights the way it had stopped asking Emmett Fenwick and the Delaneys and the Marrows. He had touched his hat to her on the way out, the same practiced courtesy Vance himself wore like a coat, and Sabine had stood at her gate, a long while after his dust settled, reading that notice over twice, understanding with a cold clarity that the 9 days weren't really an offer. They were a schedule. If frontier stories about widows who won't quit keep you watching, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It costs less than a coffee and keeps stories like this coming. She had one hired hand left by then, an old cowman named Gideon Pace who'd worked the place since before Sabine and Josiah ever arrived, a widower himself with nowhere else particular to be, and a stubbornness about the marrow ground that ran nearly as deep as Sabine's own. They had spent the first week of the countdown doing what people do when the arithmetic has already turned against them and there's nothing left but to keep working anyway, mending fence, moving cattle off the exposed north pasture, hauling extra water barrels up from the creek, and setting them at intervals around the barn and the house. A defense that both of them understood without ever saying so plainly to each other wouldn't do much against a fire set with real intent by men who knew what they were doing. Gideon had ridden into town twice that week trying to raise interest among the other 5 families in some kind of joint stand, a petition to the territorial marshal's office, anything, and had come back both times with nothing but polite refusals and lowered eyes, because every family that had already signed away their own acreage had a powerful incentive not to make trouble for the man who'd bought them out, and every family understood, better than Gideon wanted to admit, exactly what kind of trouble that would be. Gideon had come to that flat long before Sabine or Josiah, either one having ridden in as a younger man with a Texas drive that never went home again, and had buried a wife of his own on a rise behind the Marrow Soddy 19 years back, a fever that took her in a single bad week the winter after they'd staked their own claim 2 sections over. Wah, to claim Gideon, had sold off cheap not long after, unable to keep working ground that only reminded him of her absence in it. Josiah had taken him on as a hand the following spring more out of plain neighborliness than any real need for the labor, and Gideon had simply never left, working the Marrow place through 8 years of Josiah's slow, careful proving up and 18 more months of Sabine's grief besides. Because a man who has already buried one home doesn't take kindly to watching another one threatened by anything so cheap and ordinary as greed. He kept a small cabin of his own near the creek, ate his supper most evenings at Sabine's table out of habit more than invitation, and had made it plain to her more than once in the 18 months since Josiah's death that whatever came for the Marrow place would have to come through him first. An offer Sabine had never quite known how to properly thank him for beyond keeping his coffee cup filled and never once suggesting he take his stubbornness somewhere safer. It was on the 7th night of the 9, a cold, clear night with the first real bite of the coming winter in it, that Sabine heard something moving in the dark past her chicken coop and came out onto the porch with Josiah's old shotgun in her hands, expecting, half hoping, in the tired. Wired way a person hopes for a fight they at least understand the shape of, Coy Latham come early to finish the countdown ahead of schedule. What she found instead when her lantern light finally caught him was a stranger on his hands and knees in the yard, having crawled the better part of a quarter mile from wherever his horse had given out or been shot from under him, one hand pressed hard against his own side where blood had already soaked black through his shirt in the lantern light. His gun belt still buckled on, but the holster empty, as though the fight that put the bullet in him had cost him his own weapon along with most of the blood he had left to lose. He didn't ask for a doctor, and he didn't ask for her name, and when she demanded to know who he was and what business had put a hole in him on her land, he gave her only the barest truth a dying man bothers with, that his name was Ezra, that the men who'd shot him were 3 miles back and likely done looking for a body they already believed was finished, and that he needed one night, just one, in whatever shelter she could spare, and would be gone before it cost her anything. He gave it the way a man gives something he doesn't expect to be granted, already half turned to crawl back into the dark and finish dying somewhere that wouldn't trouble her. And it was that, the readiness to leave rather than ask twice, that decided Sabine more than anything else about him. She had spent 18 months watching men take what they wanted from that flat without ever once asking properly, and here was a man bleeding out in her yard who'd rather crawl off and die alone than presume on a stranger's mercy, and something in her simply refused to let that particular kind of pride finish killing him. She got him into the barn rather than the house. A decision half practical and half instinctive. A wounded stranger with an empty holster and men behind him hunting a body was not a thing to bring under her own roof until she understood more of what she'd taken in, and between her own strength and what little Ezra had left to lend the effort. They got him settled into a stall bedded thick with clean straw, and Sabine spent the better part of that night by lantern light, doing the work she'd learned, doing for Josiah's cattle, and twice for Josiah himself in lesser emergencies, working the bullet free with a knife blade heated over the lantern flame, and a steadiness of hand she did not entirely feel, packing the wound with clean cloth and the last of her carbolic, and sitting with him afterward through the worst of the fever. And she had already decided, somewhere in the middle of that long night, that she was not going to let either happen under her own roof, barn, or otherwise. He surfaced from the fever twice before dawn, each time lucid just long enough to take a little water and study her face in the lantern light with an attention that had nothing weak about it despite everything else that was. And by the second time his eyes had gone clear enough that Sabine found herself studying him back. Noting things she filed away without entirely meaning to, the calluses on his gun hand that didn't match a cowhand's calluses, the way even fever week he'd positioned himself in the stall so he could see the barn door without turning his head, in a plain, unhurried way that had nothing to do with vanity, one of the more striking men she'd had cause to look at closely in some while, lean and hard-jawed with a dark stubble shadow and steady gray eyes that tracked her with a kind of grateful, careful watchfulness even at his weakest. She chalked the noticing up to a tired woman's mind wandering somewhere safer than 9 days in a countdown, and mostly believed it. By the third morning Ezra could sit upright without the room swimming on him, and by the fourth he was walking the length of the barn on his own power, slow and careful, but walking. And Sabine, who had made plain to him on the second day that he was welcome to whatever recovery time he needed, but that she couldn't feed a stranger's horse and a stranger's silence both forever, began, without quite deciding to, learning small true things about him in the gaps between the things he still wouldn't share. He never once pressed her for the particulars of the notice nailed to her gatepost or the countdown running under all of it, though she caught him more than once studying that notice himself, reading it over slow the way a man reads something he already half understands the shape of from long practice with its type. He mended a sagging hinge on the barn door the second morning he could stand without prompting, reset a fence post the third, and, on the fourth, walking the near pasture with her at a pace matched carefully to whatever strength he'd regained. "This post's been moved," he said, low, running a thumb along the base of it. "Recent. Grass hasn't grown back into the old hole yet." He looked up at her. "You notice anybody surveying your line since your husband passed?" Sabine hadn't, not that she'd noticed, and Ezra walked the rest of that fence line slower after finding it, checking 3 more corners against the Platte map Josiah had kept folded in an old cigar box, and found 2 more stakes shifted the same careful, always in a direction that meant nothing to a casual glance, and, everything to a man measuring water rights in fractions of an acre over a long enough season. It was the kind of theft that only made sense to a thief who expected years to finish the job rather than months, and Ezra's face, studying those moved stakes, went still in a way that made plain to Sabine, more clearly than any name he'd yet given her, that whatever had put a bullet in him had come from a world that understood this exact kind of patient, invisible cruelty from the inside. He didn't explain himself that day either, but something had shifted between them by the fifth morning, a wary, careful trust, built out of small, unremarkable things, the way he split kindling on his own, unprompted, and stacked it neat against the coming winter. The way he'd taken to sitting where he could watch the road without ever seeming to be watching it, the way Sabine had started without entirely noticing the change in herself, telling him things over supper she hadn't spoken of to anyone since Josiah died, the exact shape of the fear that lived under 9 days becoming 8, becoming 7. Ezra mostly listened. When he did talk, it was careful and spare, but there was a weight underneath even his smallest sentences that let her know he understood loss the way a person understands it, from the inside, not the way people in town understood it, offering their sympathy from a safe, careful distance. There was an evening in the middle of that fifth day, the light gone long and gold across the flat the way it does in early October, before the cold sets in for good, when Sabine found Ezra out past the corral teaching himself to walk without favoring the still healing wound, pacing the fence line slow and deliberate the way a man tests ground he isn't entirely sure will hold him, and she'd stood a while at the corral rail, just watching, not wanting to interrupt whatever private reckoning he seemed to be having with his own body. He'd caught her watching eventually, and instead of the careful, guarded half-smile he usually offered when caught at something, he'd simply nodded her over, and the two of them had ended up sitting together on the top rail as the light went down, not talking about Vance or the countdown or anything of consequence at all. Just the ordinary small talk of two people learning the shape of each other, her memories of the 8 years building this place with Josiah, his memories, carefully edited, of a boyhood in the nations. It was the first evening in 18 months Sabine had laughed at something without immediately feeling guilty for it afterward, a small, unremarkable fact that she turned over privately long after Ezra had gone back to the barn to sleep, surprised at how much room the feeling still took up in a chest she'd assumed had gone permanently narrow with grief. Old man Fenwick sent word 2 days later, a folded scrap of paper carried out by his grandnephew on a borrowed mule, 3 lines in a shaking, half-blind hand that Sabine had to read twice to make out clearly that he'd heard talk in town of a stranger on the Marrow place, that he didn't know what kind of man he was, but that if there was fighting coming to that flat at last, Emmett Fenwick still had one good eye and a shotgun that worked fine, even if the rest of him didn't, and Sabine could send for him the hour it mattered. She folded the note away in the same cigar box that held Josiah's old plat map, moved almost beyond words by the offer of a half-blind old man who had already paid this particular debt in full once and was volunteering without hesitation to pay it again. That reminded her the flat hadn't entirely forgotten how to be neighbors, whatever fear had done to the rest of it. It was coy Latham who broke the fragile quiet of that fifth day, riding up to the gate at mid-morning with 2 other Circle V riders trailing him, ostensibly to confirm the countdown's terms, but in practice, to see for himself what Gideon Pace's careful reports back to town had already made him curious about, a stranger's horse standing in the Marrow corral that hadn't been there 9 days before. Latham was a broad, sun-cured man with a segundo's easy cruelty, the kind that came from years of doing a range boss's uglier work and never once being made to answer for it, and he sat his horse at the gate studying Ezra. Upright now, heeled enough to stand easy with his weight balance, though still unarmed and dressed plain, with the particular assessing look of a man cataloging whether a stranger was worth worrying about, didn't know the widow Marrow'd taken on a hired hand. Latham's voice carried the pleasant testing quality of a man who already suspected the answer wasn't that simple. Colonel likes to know who's working ground he's got an interest in. Ezra's own voice stayed even unhurried, a man answering a question that didn't much concern him. Might want to mention that to your colonel next time you're carrying his messages instead of nailing them to fence posts yourself. Something flickered behind Latham's easy expression at that, a small, quick recalculation, the look of a man realizing a stranger had noticed a detail he hadn't expected. Noticed, and he covered it fast with a wider smile that didn't reach his eyes, touched his hat to Sabine, and rode out without pressing further, though he took one long look back at Ezra over his shoulder before the gate closed behind him, a look Ezra returned without blinking, and did not remark on afterward, though Sabine saw him watch the riders dust a long while after they'd gone. That night, sitting on the porch step while Ezra worked oil into a hinge he'd already fixed twice, more from the habit of keeping his hands busy than any real need, Sabine finally put the question to him plainly. The one she'd been holding back for 5 days out of a mixture of manners and fear of the answer. Who did that to you out there? And don't tell me it doesn't concern me, because you're bleeding on my straw and eating my supper, and I think I've earned knowing at least that much. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse her outright, the way he'd refused every gentler version of the same question all week. But when he finally opened up, his voice had dropped into something rawer than the careful, measured tone he'd used with Latham. Man named Otto Rule runs muscle for a syndicate 2 territories east that does exactly what your colonel's doing here, buys the water, starves out the families sitting on it, waits for the fires to do the rest of the persuading. I've spent longer than I care to say making that particular business unprofitable for men like him, and 3 nights back his crew finally got tired of losing money on my account and decided to settle it permanent. He set the oil can down. I don't make a habit of explaining myself, Sabine, but you didn't have to pull a bullet out of a stranger with your own hands, and you did, so I figure you're owed more than a habit's worth of silence. Enjoying stories where quiet mercy gets repaid in full tap, join beside the channel name and become a member. It's a small thing that keeps these stories coming every week. What he still hadn't shared with her that night, or the several after it, was the rest of it, that the drifting, purposeful war he'd been waging against outfits like Otto Rule's Syndicate had a name attached to it, and that the reason he'd spent 6 years hunting down exactly this kind of patient, fire-set cruelty traced back to a summer he almost never mentioned, 17 years gone, when a land syndicate not so different from the Circle V had burned his own family's claim in the nations, and a 14-year-old boy who couldn't do one single thing to stop it had grown up into a man who'd made very sure ever since that he could. He'd worn a badge for a while in his 20s, found the law too slow and too easily bought to satisfy what that summer had left in him, and had spent the years since as something the law never quite had a clean name for. Not an outlaw, not quite a bounty man, something closer to a debt collector for people who had run out of anywhere else to collect from. And in 3 territories, the men who ran syndicates like Vance's had a name for him, spoken low and rare, a name he hadn't given Sabine yet. Ezra Colter, the gun that broke the Sweetwater Land Company 2 years before, and the Drennan outfit the year after that. A man who had ridden into every burned-over flat since, with the particular unhurried patience of someone settling a debt that would never, no matter how many syndicates he broke, come out fully even. The 6th day brought the first real test of what Ezra was willing to reveal of himself, and it came not from Latham but from Vance himself, who rode up to the Marrow gate that afternoon alone, unhurried as ever, and found Ezra out front, mending the same gate hinge Latham had watched him repair once already. Precisely to be visible and unremarkable when the colonel finally came to look him over personally. Vance was a lean, silver-templed man in his 50s, who wore his fine gray coat like a second skin, and carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had built an empire on other men's fear without ever once needing to raise his own voice to earn it. And he sat his gelding at the gate studying Ezra with an attention considerably sharper than Latham's had been. "Understand you took a fall somewhere east of here?" Vance's voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man discussing weather. "Widow Marrow's been kind enough to see you mended. I make it my business to know who's recovering on land I've got a considerable interest in is all, nothing personal in the asking. Nothing personal in the answering either. Fell in with the wrong company is all it was. Company's mostly settled now." Mostly, Vance let the words sit a moment, and something in his easy expression sharpened just slightly, a man doing arithmetic behind a pleasant face. "You've got the look of a man whose company tends to end up considerably more settled than mostly, mister. I don't believe the widow mentioned your surname. She wouldn't have, I never gave it." Ezra finally straightened, meeting Vance's eyes directly for the first time, and something passed between the two men in that look that Sabine, watching from the porch, couldn't have named precisely, but felt land in her stomach like a stone dropped down a well. Not quite recognition, not yet. But the particular wary stillness of two men, each recalculating what the other one might actually be. Figure a man's surname is his own business, same as a colonel's militia commission is his. Neither one of us seems in a hurry to produce paperwork. Vance's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the first crack Sabine had ever seen in that careful, pleasant surface, and for a long moment he simply looked at Ezra with the flat, assessing attention of a man filing away a threat he couldn't yet fully identify. Then the smoothness came back over his face, a beat too deliberate to be entirely natural. No paperwork needed between neighbors. I'll leave you to your hinge. He touched his hat toward the porch, the same practiced courtesy he'd shown Sabine twice before, and rode out at an unhurried walk that fooled nobody watching him go, because a man doesn't ride away that carefully unless something in the conversation behind him has actually rattled loose. Ward travels strange distances on an open flat, and it was 3 days later, on what had become the 8th day of Sabine's 9, that the rattling Vance had found its shape in town. A horse trader named Dade Cormier, passing through with a string of remounts he was hoping to sell the Circle V, had stopped in the mercantile that Emmett Fenwick now lived above, and had happened to mention, over coffee with the storekeeper. A stranger he'd glimpsed out on the Marrow Road, who put him powerfully in mind of a wanted dodger he'd seen tacked up 2 years back in a Sweetwater land office, a lean, gray-eyed man credited, in the careful language such dodgers used with breaking up a syndicate's entire operation. Ma in bold type Cormier still remembered clear Ezra Colter. The storekeeper passed it to a customer, the customer carried it on to the livery, and by that evening the name Ezra Colter had made its way in the particular hushed urgency small towns reserve for exactly this kind of news. Whatever Vance felt hearing that name spoken plainly for the first time, he didn't show it to Trask. But coy Latham, standing at his employer's shoulder in the colonel's own study that evening, watched something go through Vance's face that he had never once seen there, but the particular cold recalculation of someone realizing the ground under a long, careful plan had shifted without warning. Vance had heard the name Ezra Colter before, in low, uneasy conversations among other cattlemen and land speculators who'd watched syndicates twice the size of the Circle V come apart inside weeks once Colter decided to take a personal interest, and he understood that the stranger recovering in the Marrow barn was not some drifter who'd stumbled onto his flat by accident. He had been found. If you've made it this far into Sabine's story, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It costs less than your coffee and helps more than you'd think. Vance moved fast. After that, faster than the careful, patient man on the flat had moved in 4 years of slow, methodical acquisition, and the change in pace was, in its own way, the clearest confirmation Ezra could have wanted that Colter's reputation had landed exactly as intended. Latham rode out the next morning, the 8th day of the countdown, with orders that were no longer about patience. He was to press every one of the 5 already signed families for information on precisely what the stranger had done, and he was to send word to a man Vance kept on retainer in the territorial capital, a lawyer skilled at moving quiet title deeds through county records, faster than any legitimate transaction had a right to move, with instructions to have Sabine's own deed ready for a forced sale filing the moment the 9th day expired. Vance had built the Circle V on the principle that money and patience together could outweigh almost anyone. But a man like Ezra Colter, camped inside the one obstacle left on his flat, was a different order of problem, and Vance understood with the flat certainty of a man who had survived exactly this kind of threat before by moving first. That patience had just become a luxury he could no longer afford. Sabine learned the shape of what was coming not from Vance or Latham but from Hollis Wren, the mercantile's owner, who rode out to the Marrow place himself that evening under cover of an excuse about a feed delivery, risking more than he let on by making the trip at all, in no R8 low as the low, urgent voice of a man who'd helped bury too many of the flat's earlier casualties to stay quiet any longer. That the whole town was talking about a stranger named Colter, and that Vance's lawyer had already been sent for. It was going to happen fast, and it was going to happen with more men than the Circle V had ever bothered bringing to bear on a single homestead before. Hollis left before full dark, unwilling to be seen lingering, and Sabine stood at her gate a long while after his dust settled, the same gate where Latham had nailed the original notice, and understood that whatever mercy she'd shown a bleeding stranger 9 days before had changed the entire shape of what was now bearing down on her land. She found Ezra in the barn that night, mending tack he didn't need to mend, the same restless habit of keeping his hands occupied that she'd come to recognize in him over 9 days of careful watching, and she laid out, plainly, everything Hollis had shared, watching his face for whatever reaction the name Colter, spoken finally out loud between them, would produce. He didn't deny it. He set the tack down, and for the first time in 9 days he laid out the whole of it for her, unhurried and complete, the nations, the fire, the 14-year-old boy who'd watched his mother and sister die inside a burning cabin, and had spent the 17 years since turning that single unbearable night into a purpose he'd never once managed to set down. He walked her through the Sweetwater Company and the Drennan outfit and 4 other operations besides, syndicates that had learned, each in their own hard month, exactly what it cost to build an empire on other families' burned ground, and he confessed, last and quietest of all, that he hadn't crawled onto her land 9 days before entirely by accident, that Otto Rule's men had shot him 3 miles east because he'd already spent 2 weeks scouting the Powder River Flat, watching Vance's operation with the same patient attention he'd given 4 syndicates before it. And that whatever mercy she'd shown him that first night had arrived, as far as he was concerned, exactly where his own long war had already been headed. I could still ride out. He said it plainly, watching her in the lantern light, no weight behind it, beyond the plain fact of the offer. Tonight, if it comes to that, Vance's whole quarrel is with the man I am, not with you. And if I'm gone by morning, maybe the trouble rides off with me. Sabine had spent 9 days learning exactly what kind of man put a question like that to her honestly, prepared to accept whichever answer she gave, and, she found, standing in her own barn with a legend she'd pulled a bullet out of with her own 2 hands. Josiah built this place believing a house wasn't much of a house if it only had room for the safe and the certain. I let you in on the 7th night because you asked for nothing, and I had something to give. I'm not asking you to leave now, just because giving it turned out to cost more than I figured. She held his eyes across the lantern light. Stay, if you're staying because you want to. Not because you think you owe me for a bullet and a bed of straw. Wasn't planning to leave for either reason. Something moved behind his steady gray eyes that hadn't been there in 9 days of careful watchfulness. Something that had less to do with syndicates and burned cabins than with the particular fact of a woman standing in front of him unafraid of exactly what he was. Figured I'd stay because it's your fight now, whether either of us likes the arithmetic of that or not. And I've got a considerable amount of practice evening arithmetic like Vance's. The 9th day arrived, cold and clear, the kind of high plains autumn morning that gave no hint of what was coming until it came. And Sabine spent the early hours doing the small, useless, necessary things a person does when a deadline they can't outrun has finally arrived, moving what stock remained to the far pasture past the creek, filling every water barrel to its brim, checking the shotgun Josiah had left her and the rifle Ezra had borrowed off Gideon. Though both of them understood a rifle and a shotgun would not be the deciding factor if Vance brought the number of riders Hollis Wren's warning had suggested. Gideon Pace refused, flatly and without much discussion, to be sent off the property for his own safety, informing Sabine in language considerably saltier than his usual manner, that he'd buried better men than Coy Latham. Ezra spent the morning walking the property's approaches with the careful, methodical attention of a man who had done this exact reconnaissance on 4 prior flats, marking sight lines, moving the water barrels to positions that would matter more than decoration, and saying very little. The particular stillness of a man settling into work he understood completely. Vance's riders came at dusk, 9 of them counting Latham, torches already lit, and carried high the way a man carries something he wants seen coming. A deliberate cruelty meant to give Sabine every long minute of watching them approach across open ground to understand exactly what was riding toward her home. Vance himself rode at the column's head, his fine gray coat catching the last orange light, flanked by his territorial lawyer carrying a folder of papers that would mean nothing at all once the fire those torches promised had finished its work, because a deed for scorched ground sells considerably cheaper than a deed for a working homestead. And Vance had learned that particular arithmetic a long time before he ever set eyes on the Powder River flat. He stopped his column at the gate, the same gate that had held the original 9-day notice, and raised his voice across the yard, a tone that had finally, for the first time in 4 years on that flat, lost every trace of its patient, pleasant courtesy. 9 days, Widow Marrow, same as promised. I'm a man of my word, whatever else you've heard about me tonight. He nodded toward the folder in his lawyer's hands. Sign, now, peaceful, and you and your hand and whatever's left of your stranger, ride out of here with your lives and a fair price. Refuse, and my men burn every board on this place down to the foundation stones, same as they did for the Delaney's and Fenwick and everyone else. Fool enough to make me say it twice. He paused, and something colder came into his voice. And your Mr. Colter can stand wherever he pleases while they do it. 9 men against 1 legend still comes out 9-1. Last I did the arithmetic. It was Ezra who stepped out from the barn shadow to answer him. Unhurried, unarmed hands held loose and easy at his sides in a way that fooled nobody watching who understood what those hands were actually capable of, and his voice, when it came, carried clean across the whole yard in the particular flat. The unshakable register of a man who had spoken some close variation of this same sentence to 4 other range bosses before Vance, and had meant it every single time. You did the arithmetic wrong, Colonel. It's not 9 against 1. It's 9 against a woman who pulled a bullet out of me with her own hands and never once counted what it would cost her, and a hired man who buried better men than Latham before either of you were grown, and a man who spent 17 years making sure operations exactly like yours. You want to strike a match tonight. You go right ahead and strike it. But you ought to know before you do that I've watched 4 syndicates, bigger than the Circle V, burn down to nothing behind men who thought the numbers were as simple as you're making them out to be right now. What happened across the next several minutes in the Marrow yard passed into the kind of telling on that flat, and considerably beyond it, that people retold for years afterward, with the particular reverent exaggeration reserved for things that were already remarkable enough without embellishment. Latham, never a patient man, even by Circle V standards, went for his pistol first at a nod from Vance, and Ezra's own hand moved with a speed that Sabine, watching from the porch with Josiah's shotgun already leveled, would afterward describe to her own children as the fastest thing she had ever witnessed a human body do. A single shot that took the pistol clean out of Latham's grip before the segundo's own weapon had cleared its holster, followed inside the same heartbeat by a second shot that put a torch flying out of the hand of the rider. Gideon Pace, positioned at the water trough with Josiah's old buffalo rifle exactly where Ezra had positioned him that morning, put around through a second torch, a heartbeat later, and Sabine herself, steady in a way that surprised even her, leveled the shotgun at the third rider still holding flame and informed him, in a voice she didn't recognize as entirely her own, that he could set that torch down in the dirt or she would put both barrels through whatever part of him was closest. The fight, such as it was, lasted less than a minute, because 9 riders who had come prepared to burn an undefended homestead discovered, in the space of 4 gunshots, that they had ridden instead into the one exact confrontation Ezra Colter had spent 17 years perfecting. one-sided burning did not, as a rule, have much appetite left over for a fair fight against a legend once the easy part disappeared. 2 more riders lost their weapons to shots that never once drew blood, a precision Ezra maintained deliberately through the whole exchange because he understood, better than Vance had ever understood him, that killing 9 hired men wouldn't finish anything the courts couldn't finish better, with all 9 of them alive to testify against the man who'd sent them. Vance himself sat frozen on his gelding through the entire brief exchange, the fine gray coat and unhurried courtesy stripped away in the space of a minute to reveal, underneath, exactly what Sabine had suspected all along lived there, a man whose whole empire had been built on the assumption that nobody would ever call his bluff hard enough to matter, and who had finally, on the 9th night, discovered what happened when somebody did. In the hush, right after the last shot, before anyone from town had arrived to make the reckoning official, Sabine crossed the yard on legs that didn't feel entirely her own, and stood beside Ezra while the disarmed riders sat sullen in the dirt under Gideon's steady old buffalo rifle, and looked past all of them to where Colonel Vance still sat frozen on his gelding, his fine gray coat suddenly looking, in the torchlight, like something borrowed rather than owned. She didn't shout at him, and she didn't ask him to explain himself, because 18 months of grief, compressed hard and small, had taught her there was no explanation a man like that could give that would make the arithmetic of a burned husband and a dead man's homestead come out fair. She only told him in a voice steadier than she felt that Josiah Marrow had proved up this ground with nothing but patience and honest work, and that whatever the colonel had spent 4 years believing about widows and water rights, the flat still belonged, that night and every night after. Vance said nothing back. There was, for the first time in 4 years on that flat, nothing left in his careful arithmetic worth saying. Sheriff Ogilvy Trask arrived from town a half-hour later, summoned by a rider Hollis Wren had sent the moment gunfire carried across the flat, and found a scene that made the choice Vance's money had bought him considerably harder to maintain in front of witnesses. 3 extinguished torches lying dead in the dirt as plain evidence of exactly what they'd been sent to do, and a range boss whose careful, pleasant authority had entirely deserted him, standing beside a lawyer clutching a stack of for-sale papers that suddenly looked considerably more like evidence of a conspiracy. Trask had spent 4 years finding it convenient to look away from the Circle V's methods, but a sheriff cannot look away from 9 armed men and 3 unlit torches standing in a widow's yard, with half the flat's remaining families arriving behind him to see for themselves, weighing his own badge against a truth that had finally become too public and too plain to bury, arrested Coy Latham on the spot for attempted arson, and, within the week, once Hollis, Wren, and 3 other townsfolk found their courage sufficient to testify to what Ezra's reputation and Vance's own desperate haste had finally made undeniable. Dodd arrested Colonel Rourke Vance himself. The territorial investigation that followed, aided considerably by a lawyer in the capital who found it suddenly much more profitable to cooperate with prosecutors than continue serving a client facing arson and conspiracy charges, that the fire which killed Josiah Marrow 18 months before had been set on Vance's direct order, the same patient method used against the Delaneys and Fenwick and the vanished Marrow family, a pattern of deliberate destruction stretching back 4 full years across the entire Powder River Flat. Vance stood trial the following spring and was convicted on charges that would keep him well past any reasonable expectation of ever again controlling so much as a single acre and the Circle V's holdings seized and broken up by territorial order, though the Delaneys never came back from Nebraska, and old Emmett Fenwick, though he received his acreage back in full, remained too crippled by that earlier fire to ever work it again, a small permanent cost that no verdict, however just, could fully undo. Sabine kept her 160 acres along the good bend of the creek, and the water rights that had made her the last, most stubborn obstacle to a range boss's empire remained exactly where Josiah had proved them up. Ezra Colter stayed on through that winter and the following spring, mending fences and splitting kindling, with the same quiet, purposeful patience he'd shown from his first upright day in her barn, and if the whole flat noticed, and eventually stopped, pretending not to notice, that the legendary gunslinger, who'd broken 5 land syndicates across 3 territories, had finally found a piece of ground worth staying still for, nobody begrudged the widow Marrow the particular happiness that grew slow and steady across that following year. A little at a time, honestly, with room left over, always, for whatever came asking with nothing but its own quiet need. Old man Fenwick got his own acreage back in the territorial settlement, and though the fire that had crippled him 2 winters before had left him too blind and too broken to work it properly again, he leased the ground out to a young family newly arrived from Ohio and spent his remaining years above the mercantile, telling anyone who'd listen the story of the night a legend stood up in a widow's barn, embellishing it a little more, until the version he told at the end bore only a passing resemblance to what Sabine remembered actually happening and was, by her own quiet admission, considerably more exciting. Gideon Pace stayed on at the Marrow place the rest of his days, refusing every offer Sabine ever made to formalize his standing there beyond a hired man's wages, content, it seemed, simply to have one more home worth defending after the loss of his first, patient in exactly the way he'd always been, patient with everything else that mattered to him. The notice Coy Latham had once nailed to Sabine's gatepost stayed up through that whole winter, weathering slowly, under snow and thaw, 9 days written across it in Vance's own careful ruined hand, and Sabine never did take it down herself. Ezra was the one who finally pulled it loose the following spring, the morning he put the question to her, in the same plain, unhurried voice he'd used to offer to ride out of her trouble 6 months before whether she'd consider making a temporary arrangement considerably more permanent, and he folded that old weathered notice once quietly, and set it on the kitchen table between them like a debt finally closed out in full. The last small piece of Colonel Vance's arithmetic, settled at last on terms the widow Marrow had written herself. Made of it traveled the flat the way word always had, faster than any rider could carry it, and by the time the first hard frost of that second winter came around, nobody on the Powder River flat called her the widow Marrow anymore. Watching Ezra Colter's split kindling at first light every morning, with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything else worth staying still for, called him a stranger either.